Hi everybody, Baron here with Mando Lessons. Hope you're all doing well. In this week's lesson, we are going to be talking about chop chords. I want to take a couple lessons actually to just kind of dive into chop chords a little more deeply. I've talked about chop chords in the past. You can search that at my website, mandolessons.com, if you want to see what I've talked about in the past, but this is no experience required. I want to sort of take us from thinking about, the classic chop chord that we all see when we first pick up the instrument. It's definitely, one of the harder chords to wrap our fingers around. And I want to break that down a little bit, give you some other options of ways to play, and give you a little insight into how I think about chop chords in little kind of interval clusters that will simultaneously do a couple things for you. One, it'll help your left hand relax and not have to grab these huge chord shapes. And two, it'll also give you a little insight into some arpeggios and kind of moving up and down the neck, all sorts of great fretboard mapping ideas. Before we jump in here, I do want to say that all my lessons are always free, but there are a couple ways to donate if that's so you're choosing. Links in the description to a PayPal page, as well as a Patreon membership page where you can get access to lessons a day early, patron-only live streams, and some other perks like that. Not required, but greatly appreciated, and helps me put out new lessons every single week, and also do live streams on the weekends. So subscribe if you haven't already. That's free, and let's jump into the lesson. All right, so chop chords. You're probably somewhat familiar with seeing people talk about and use this big shape. Starts out like your classic G shape on the mandolin, and then you add 5th fret with your ring finger, and then the real killer is the 7th fret on the G string with your pinky. You kind of slide around like that, from G over to C, up to D, and back to G. Now, that's a lot to ask of someone who's first picking up an instrument. I know when somebody first showed me that, I was like, yeah, right, that's never going to happen. But I did get used to it, and I would say that most people will get used to it. If you just keep trying to get your hand into that shape, every time you pick up the instrument, take 10 seconds and just, see if you can get your hand in that shape. It's not going to work at first, but again, every time you pick up the instrument, try to make that once or twice a day, even if it's just for a short period. Spend the first few seconds just trying to get your hand in that shape, and then move on to something more fun. That's really going to help stretch out your hand and work with your technique in general about kind of how your hand is positioned on the instrument to really make things click. But until then, what are we supposed to do? We're hoping to play some bluegrass. We're hoping to be that nice kind of snare drum offbeat sound of really percussive. How do we do that when we can't make that big shape? Well, I've talked about this a little bit before, but I'm going to go over it again here. What I like to do is just simplify everything down to 2 strings. So when I play my big chop chord shapes, sounds like that. When I play 2-string chop chord shapes, sounds almost identical, because when I'm playing these shapes, I'm not putting a whole lot of emphasis on these high strings, the A and E strings, and most of the sound is coming from the D and G strings. So that we're both kinds of chop chords back to back. We had the 4-string and the 2-string. And by putting all that emphasis on the G and D strings, I think it leaves a little space for melodies that are going to be happening on a fiddle or a mandolin up on the A and E strings. And it gives our hand a break from having to kind of wrestle with these huge chop shapes as beginner mandolin players. Or, honestly, I often will go to these 2-string chop shapes. Not to say that beginner is kind of the only people that use them. I use them all the time, and I've been playing for over 20 years now. It's just sort of my preference a lot of the time. So what's going on here? Well, you can think about it a couple ways. You can think about it in sort of a kind of a shape concept, which is, okay, we've got our G chop shape, and we're just using the notes that are on the G and D string, so we only need these 2 strings, and we're just moving our fingers from pinky on the 7th and ring on the 5th to something else. It doesn't necessarily matter what it is. Could be ring on the middle on the 7th, pointer on the 5th, or it could be ring on the 7th, middle on the 5th. Let's do that with the ring on the 7th and middle on the 5th of the D, because that's going to help us shift into some other shapes a little bit easier. It's going to depend on kind of what chop shapes and double stops you're using, but for now, just to pick one, let's do ring finger, 7th fret of the G, middle finger, 5th fret of the D. And then as we go from that big G shape over to the big C shape, we get 2/3 of our C chord in the 2-string version. So usually it's that. We're just going to leave off our A string, and we have 5 on the G, 2 on the D. So now we have G to C, 5 and 2. And our D chord, so it's going to slide that 2 frets towards the bridge, 7 and 4, back to 7 and 5. So that gives us a nice little set of double stops, 7 and 5, 5 and 2, 7 and 4 to 7 and 5 is G, C, D, G, G, D, G. So that's a great exercise if you're working out of the key of G, and one key at a time is always a great way to really get this stuff into your head rather than thinking there's 12 keys, I should learn them all at once. Start with G. It's a very common key. So that's a great exercise to do on your own. Get those under your fingers, and then just make sure you are, knowing what chord you're playing. So saying G, and then C, and then D, and then G, maybe mix it up a little bit, and then C, and then D, and then C, and then G. And by, verbally saying the chord that you're playing, you're really going to reinforce not only the muscle memory in your left hand, but also your understanding of what's going on kind of mentally. So, what about keys outside of G? What about the key of C? Well, we already have our C chord. So that's a good starting place, 5 and 2. We already have our G chord. So what are the two? Well, first we have to ask is, what are our 3 chords in the key of C? We have C, and then I like to think on my fingers, you need a 1, 4, and 5 chord. You just count up a C scale, C, D, E, F, G, C, F, G. So we need a C chord, an F chord, and a G chord. We already have our C, and we already have our G. So all we need now is an F chord. The way I like to think about it is we have our G chord. We can move that down 2 frets or towards the nut. Is G, F sharp, F. And now we have our F chord. So we're going to start with C, 5 and 2. 5 and 3. 7 and 5. Back to C, 5 and 2. We've got 5 and 2 is a C, and 5 and 3 is an F, and 7 and 5 is a G. Back to 5 and 2 is C, C. 5 and 3 is F. 7 and 5 is G. 5 and 2 is C. So with those 2 little patterns, our first being 7 and 5, 2 and 3, 7 and 4 as our 1 chord, 4 chord, 5 chord. So I think of that as like my G shapes double stop chop chords. It's kind of a long name. And then our C shape double stop chop chords is 5 and 2. Then kind of the middle finger comes into 5 and 3. Slide to 7 and 5, back down to 5 and 2. That's going to give us access to every key as long as we can slide around a little bit on the instrument. So Let's see, how about the key of F? Well, here we go, F. So we start with that F chord. And now we're going to go down to third fret on the G string. And we have an open D string. Now we'll talk about that in a future lesson, but for now, it's essentially with F down to, and what would be our G to C is now F to B flat. We have that open D string. We'll come to fixing that in a future lesson, and then you slide that up to our C chord, 5 and 2, back to F. So as you are called upon to play in different keys, let's think about, okay, how about the key of D? Well, we have our D chord from G, C, D. So there's our starting point. And it really works best if starting with G, C, and D, you're probably going to have, then saying, okay, now I need the key of D. Start with that D chord that you're using in the G progression. So we have our D, and then what's our 4 chord? D, E, F sharp, G, A. G is our 4 and A is our 5. So we have D, then to G, which we already have again. Slide up 2 to A, and back to D. So we've got D, then up to G, then up to A, back to D. So as you can see, by using chords that we have in different keys and kind of doing a little bit of troubleshooting on the instrument, we can find, using just these 2 strings, G and D, 1, 4, and 5 chords for any key that we're going to play in. It's going to take a little bit to sort of get those into your muscle memory and mental memory, for lack of a better word, but they're there. So ultimately, the farthest up we're ever really going to need to go is about B flat. So we have our G, G sharp, A, B flat, and E flat, and F, and back to E flat. B flat. And then if we need to go to B, we could keep going up, but we also have our B right here. So as you get further up, it's going to get less and less, ergonomical to play, as you don't need to be way up here. So starting with the key of B, we have B, C, C sharp, D, E flat, E, F, F sharp, and at that point, I think I'm far enough. Because when you get to that F sharp there, you also have it in your kind of what I think of as the G shape. F sharp, then B, then C sharp, then back to F sharp. Now you probably aren't going to be doing a lot of playing in F sharp and B and things like that when you're first starting out on the instrument, but that was just an exercise to show you that they're all there. So that's all for this week. Your homework is to find a couple different keys, maybe G, C, D, and A. Find those little double stop kind of clusters of notes and get comfortable with 1, 4, and 5. Make sure you're saying the chords as you play them, the chord names. So if you're playing G, C, and D, say G when you're playing G, C when you're playing C, and D when you're playing D. And that'll really help kind of congeal everything together and make it a little more natural for you. In the next lesson, we're going to dive into some other shapes and other ideas, still staying on those 2 strings. So subscribe if you haven't already, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye-bye.